Hi, everybody. This is Jimmy, and you're reading with Jimmy. We're reading Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, and this is Sir Topaz's Tale, interpretation by yours truly, Jimmy. This'll be a short one, but it's a very, very important one. So what happened? Well, I'm here to tell you, if you read the tale with me, not much, right? But this is the most interesting tale, in my opinion, because it's more about the anonymous narrator than the tale itself. This is very important because don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, the anonymous narrator has been narrating all of the tales to us. He tells us what the summoner says, what the pardoner says, what the nun's priest tale. He tells us what these travelers tell us through him. So in a way, he's like a third-person narrator, but he's not. He's actually in the story in one of the pilgrims. So when the host in this tale of Sir Topaz calls upon him to tell his tale, first he says, I don't know. And if you read the tale with me, you'll find out that it really is a strange tale, isn't it? It starts with a prologue, but unfortunately, Morrison, the translator, also cuts the tale short. Remember the brackets we used in some tales when he gives us these brackets? He's limited by space, of course, when he published this. But this tale gives us information about the first-person anonymous narrator, and that's very important to understanding all the tales and digesting them in terms of the light that it may throw on all these tales. It's really the only place, in all the tales we've been reading together, it's really the only place where we find out about this guy, this anonymous narrator, who, by the way, is not Chaucer. Remember that? I tell you that when we're analyzing these tales. The anonymous narrator tells us the tale of the pilgrim who's telling it to the other pilgrims, but he is not Chaucer. He's never named. That's why he stays the anonymous narrator. So, what we're doing today is we're going to do an interpretation of Sir Topaz's tale. In other words, the anonymous narrator tells us about Sir Topaz's tale. This is not just the tale like the other tales, but is really a reflection on the teller of the tale, on the anonymous narrator. For example, whenever we read a tale, we're only listening to the teller of the tale through the narration of the anonymous narrator. In Sir Topaz, they are one and the same. That is, the teller of the tale is the anonymous narrator. It's not the pardoner. It's not some other pilgrim. It's him. He's the teller of the tale. The scene is just after the prioress' tale, which is a powerful tale of anti-Semitic hatred. You remember that one? If not, go back and read it. His prologue starts out like this. This miracle of the prioress' tale so sobered every man that it was truly wonderful to see. It brought everybody out of, their stupor? No, it just woke people up. So if you don't remember what the prioress' tale was, go back and read it. But what he's telling us, the anonymous narrator, is that this sobered up every man. Were they drunk? Not everybody, but until our good host presently began to joke and for the first time looked at me. You see this? He looked at me. Who's me? Huh? Who is me? You know who me is, right? That's the anonymous narrator. Miracle is a reference to the prior tale. Remember, this was about the boy that was murdered and yet continued to sing even though he was dead. So the host takes over and he says, quote, "What kind of creature have we here?" said the host. "Eyes always on the ground. I see by habit. I think you must be looking for a rabbit. Come here, look up, give us a cheerful eye. And now, sirs, make way and let this man have a place. He's shaped around the middle as well as a puppet for any woman to embrace, in a fond arm so small, so fair of face. Judging by his looks, I'd say he's an elf. riding along there always by himself. Make yourself heard as others here have made, and tell us a merry story. So you see, the host actually points out some characteristics of the anonymous narrator, right? He's round. He's always looking at the ground. He stays by himself a lot. Why is that? Why is that? Is the host lying? No, but who's telling us what the host said? The anonymous narrator. So the anonymous narrator is using the host to describe himself. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? So the anonymous narrator is telling us that he is telling us this because what the host says. So here is your question. Is he being fair to himself in what he looks like? Remember, he's the anonymous narrator. He can describe himself any way he wants. Do you remember if you read Farewell to Arms with Me by Ernest Hemingway on this website and my YouTube channel? Lieutenant Henry, who is the narrator inside the story, he never really describes himself like this. He never says what he looks like. The reader, through his narration, has to figure that out for himself. So if you really want to know what Lieutenant Henry looks like, you have to read very carefully, or you have to read Jimmy's analysis. In any case, is he being fair in this case when he has the host describe himself? Well, let's examine this for a moment. Because there is nothing, ladies and gentlemen, nothing more important than the reliability of any narrator, except in third-person narration, he's always telling the truth. Otherwise, the story doesn't make sense. But when you're reading first-person narration like this, someone inside the story, you always have to be aware, cognizant, be astute of what that narrator's reliability is, especially when we're understanding classical literature. So he calls him a creature. What kind of creature have we here? That's the host. Sorry, not the hose. That's the host uses that word, creature. Remember, it's the anonymous narrator narrating, so he doesn't have to say that the host said creature about him, but he does. What is that? That's a carefully chosen word. All his words are carefully chosen. If you were telling a story about yourself, would you use the word creature when describing yourself to other people? I'm just a weird creature. Did you ever say that? Jimmy said I'm a weird guy, but I've never used the word creature. See, words have connotation and denotation. They mean things, and yet they connote things, and they make you feel a certain way. So, for example, if you say he died as opposed to he passed away, they both mean the same thing, but died means it's a little more harsher, you understand, than saying he passed away. You see what I'm saying? So creature, this word creature, and it is chosen by the anonymous narrator to describe himself through the host asked question, right? What kind of creature? It conjures up an image of your mind, doesn't it? What kind of image? Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com? Jimmy at readingwithjimmy.com is my email. Send me an email about what you think when you think of the word creature. When I hear the word creature, there's one thing that comes to Jimmy's mind. The Creature from the Black Lagoon was an old 50s science fiction movie. If you haven't seen it, you should see it. It's kind of campy, but that's what the word creature. You're a creature. You creature. Eyes always on the ground, I see, by habit. Eyes always on the ground. So this is the anonymous narrator telling us what the host says about himself. The narrator is looking on the ground, avoiding eye contact. Why is that? Well, maybe he's documenting what he hears, or maybe he doesn't want to be noticed, or maybe, who knows why he doesn't have eye contact. But you yourself know, or should know, when you're in real life situations, do you look people in the eye, or do you look away when you talk? There's something about eye contact that's important in life. Would you agree with me? If you're afraid to look at someone in the eye, what does that say about you? I think you must be looking for a rabbit. What does that mean? Well, maybe he's hungry, right? It suggests that the narrator is hungry. Well, the anonymous narrator is reporting what the host says about him. And remember, he's telling us this about himself. The host clears the path for him. He's shaped around the middle. He's shaped around, well, maybe he's a little large. He's a large guy. So if we can figure out what the host looks like, we can get a clue to what the narrator looks like. Because he's saying he's shaped around the middle as well as I. Who says that? The host. Who says that the host says that? The anonymous narrator. So maybe he has something in common with the host. Flip to the general prologue. Our host cut such a figure all in all that he might have been a marshal in a hall. He was a big man, and his eyes bulged wide. No sturdier citizen lived than all Cheapside. Lacking no trace of manhood, bold in speech, prudent, and well-versed in what life can teach, and with all of this, he was a jovial man. And so when supper ended, he began to jolly us. With all of our debts were clear. When all of our debts were clear. So he's describing, the anonymous narrator is describing the host. So the anonymous narrator is a big man, right? We know that. But not necessarily a fat man, though he's round in the middle. A puppet for any woman to embrace. In a fond arm so small, so fair a face. He's huggable. He's like a little teddy bear. He's a teddy bear. Maybe, maybe not. Judging by his looks, I'd say that he's an elf. Well, that's an interesting word, elf. You know what an elf is? Remember Tolkien's, right? Stories, The Hobbit? Riding along there always by himself. He calls himself through the host an elf. I've always wondered about this when I read it. What does an elf look like? Well, remember, this is medieval literature, and all dragons and elves and goblins. But the line riding by himself all the time is interesting. He's distant from the others. He's an observer. But then the host close him into the game. The host, Jimmy was typing fast when he wrote this. The host calls him into the game and asks for a merry tale. So we're going to pause here for a moment and we're going to talk about observers. Why? Because he's by himself, the anonymous narrator. He looks at the ground a lot and he stays by himself. He's more or less observing because every tale, remember, is told by him to us. He tells us what the partner says, right? What the knight says, what everybody says. He's the narrator to us. He's the window of these people to us. Observers. Albert Einstein's theory of relativity, which, by the way, you should read about, is about the relationship between observers, motion, and time. This is very important. Now, am I suggesting that the anonymous narrator or Chaucer himself knew this? No. I'm sharing this with you to help you understand narration. Narration, which in classical literature, it's essential to understand narration. So don't get turned off by this discussion. If you want to fast forward, be my guest, but you're going to miss a lot. It's important to your overall understanding of narration in classical literature. Einstein's theory says that the measurements of space and time. Did you know you can measure space? Of course you did. Take a ruler out and put it on your desk. And time. Did you know you could measure time? Just look at your watch. If you have an analog watch, even if you have a digital watch, you can watch the seconds passing by. Oh, 5 seconds passed by. Unfortunately, these measurements are not absolute. Why? Well, you should read Einstein. But let me give you a hint. Any measurement you make depends on the observer's frame of reference, your frame of reference. If we look at something and someone's standing next to us, it's going to look different to that person. The same thing that we're looking at. You know this, right? Now, if you don't know this and you know anything about shooting, target practice, you have a left or right eye dominant. You know that if you close your left eye and you aim with your right eye, and it's very different than closing your right eye and aiming with your left eye. So you have to figure out which eye is your dominant eye for target practice. It's the same thing with observers. Let me give you another example. If you're falling through space, which you're doing now on the Earth, but just imagine you're in a box falling through space and there's no windows. You're not going to even know you're falling. Well, Jimmy, that's crazy. Of course I'll know I'm falling. No, you won't. You know why you won't? Because you don't have a reference point. There's no windows. You won't feel yourself falling because you'll just be there. If you have a window, you can now know motion is happening. Either that's moving or you're moving. And suddenly you become part of the equation. Do you understand this? This is going to lead to a wonderful discussion of the anonymous narrator. So in the moment you add a window that you could see outside, you can detect motion, acceleration, and direction. And here's the key. By seeing, you're no longer a passive passenger. You're no longer in a box and you don't know what the hell's going on. You're engaging with the system. The minute you add a window, the minute you start seeing things, you become part of what you're seeing. This is a very important concept. Your awareness changes your role because now you can interpret, compare, and react. Now I want to apply this to the Canterbury Tale narrator. Okay? Without his window, without his act of observing and recounting and telling these tales, the pilgrimage would have been a closed system and we would know nothing about it. Would you agree with me on that? If he wasn't there with the pilgrims. Well, Jimmy, that defeats what you taught me about third-person narration. He could be outside the story. Exactly. He could. If you had a third-person narrator, first of all, these would be entirely different. The composition would be entirely changed, which means you can't just switch narration. You got to be consistent, and in this case, it is. He's inside the story. So by looking out and telling us what's happening with these pilgrims, he actually becomes part of the dynamic, which Sir Thopas actually proves, because the host brings him into the story. He brings him in. He is the first-person narrator inside the story, not the third person outside the story. Our narrator is no longer just riding along, singing. He's creating the record. He's participating in it. He's a participant. He's an observer. He's shaping how the group is perceived by us, the readers. His window isn't a glass per se. It's his perspective, his choice of details, and his commentary, which, by the way, reveal him to us. It's very important when you're reading these tales with Jimmy, if you've been reading them and continue to read them, that you understand this, because this is life's lesson. Everybody in real life is a first-person narrator. They're inside the story. So when people are telling you stuff, you have to ask yourself, why are they telling me this stuff? And if you tell people stuff, you have to ask, you don't have to ask, but you'd be wise to ask, why are you telling them that stuff? Of all the stuff that you can tell somebody, why are you telling them that stuff at that particular moment in time? Huh? Well, Jimmy, that's too deep for me. I can't think about that. Well, you should. You don't have to. But I'm telling you, it's going to help you lead a more fulfilling life. That's why narration and understanding narration, what people say, is very important. When you read a social media post, I'm sure you've never asked yourself, why is this person posting this particular piece of content? You just read it and react, right? You're like an uncontrollable, right? That's not the way to do this. That's not the way to lead your life, ladies and gentlemen. It's just not. It's not. So, the observer first-person narrator is never, ever, ever neutral. What does that mean? Well, Jimmy, I'm objective. Nah, you can't be objective. You're in the story. What do you mean? I'm the most objective person in the world. You may believe that, but that's not true. You're shaped. You're shaped through your past, your present, right? You're shaped by your thoughts, by your parents, by your peers, by what you read, by what you see. You understand this? So the observer is never neutral. The act of measuring changes the context. In literature, the act of narrating does the same. The narrator's position, what they notice, the beautiful language he uses in describing these pilgrims. I mean, go back and reread that slowly. Let your mind absorb what he's saying, what the narrator is telling us. And what they omit. They all shape that story. In Canterbury Tales, the anonymous narrator tells us who is writing with whom, what these people look like, and sometimes what they're thinking. Kind of injects himself into the person's thought. But it's always filtered through his own perspective. That's why Sir Thopas is an important tale to study, because it's the anonymous narrator firsthand. It's the only place you're going to see this guy. Just as in relativity, where velocity affects what you see, the speed, if you're going too fast, you lose perspective, right? The narrator's motion, his social position, his personality affects what we see through him. You understand this? So the observer actually becomes part of the system that he's narrating about. In physics, observation influences the system, not just in quantum. Jimmy, you're losing me. Quantum physics? Quantum mechanics? Geez. I don't want to lose you, so pause for a moment and just listen to what I'm saying. Observation influences the system. Your observations, you change this. I'm going to give you some examples. It's where your speed and motion change the measurements. Think about electrons for a moment. I've never seen an electron, Jimmy. Well, neither have I. But you can think about it if you read about them and if you examine atomic structure. This is the truth. The more precisely you pin down where one of these electrons is, the less you know how fast it's going, the velocity. And the more you know its velocity, the less you know where it's at. It's just, that's the way it is. That's the way it is. That's why they have so much trouble with atomic energy, right? So the narrator doesn't just report the tales, he participates in the pilgrimage, riding with them, eating with them, reacting to them. And his presence can affect how they and he behave. If the narrator were not there, think about this. Maybe some of the arguments wouldn't have happened between, the friar, right? And the summoner, right? Or certain tales wouldn't be told in the same way. By his existence, he alters the trajectory of the group dynamic. He changes everything. I can't tell you what Chaucer was thinking when he decided to put the anonymous narrator as a pilgrim. And quite frankly, it's not important. What Jimmy has always told you, it's important to read the story and stay inside the story. However, for this one moment, we're going to stop that and think about this. Chaucer was a genius. By putting the narrator inside the story, he gave us a rich tapestry of these people that the guy was observing, just like you would be if you went on a train trip Jimmy used to take the train downtown in Chicago when he was a creative director at an agency, and he would see people on the train, all manner of people. Never talked to them. Sometimes he would chat up somebody that he was sitting next to, but very rarely. He was like the anonymous narrator, and he would watch them. Some would be reading books. Some would be on their cell phones when they had cell phones. Okay? Jimmy was born before they had cell phones. Some would be reading the newspaper. Some would be sleeping. Some would be talking, in whispers to each other. It's a different experience when you're on the train than if you were talking that the train and the people who were on the train and you were outside that story. So point of view, ladies and gentlemen, I want to call your attention to this. Point of view shapes the truth. The hell does that mean, Jimmy? Well, in first-person narration, there is no universal God's eye truth. In other words, there's no third person saying, this was a good guy. The knight was a good man. There's nothing that says that. And when he's describing the knight in the prologue, we kind of have to trust the anonymous narrator's description of the knight. We don't know it's true or not, but as we read all of the tales, we get a sense of the anonymous narrator that he's pretty reliable. He's not, if he's bending the truth, we don't know he's bending it. But there is no universal, this is absolutely true. Every observer has their own frame of reference. This is why, ladies and gentlemen, classical literature written in the third person or even the first person is so powerful. Very, very powerful, and why it stood the test of time. Why? Because you can't see inside a person's head in real life. You don't know. You'll never know what they're really thinking. I love you. You'll never know when someone says that to you. Never. You have to trust. You have to believe in the narration that you're being told. There's no way you can know. Now, you could know if you mean it, if you say it, or if you don't mean it. But the person you're telling it to will have no clue. They have to go by your body language, by what you say, by what you do. And that's what makes classical literature so darn powerful. Because we have to judge these characters who are more real than real life because we actually can see them through the narrators, first and third person. Even when a story sounds omniscient, like a third person, like The Knight's Tale, we're still seeing it through the anonymous narrator's lens, which changes everything. Likewise, the narrator's frame of reference is the only one we have. We don't have any other reference except his reference. Even when we hear another pilgrim story, it's mediated through his retelling it. We don't know what the summoner really, really, really said except through the anonymous narrator. This is very complex. But then again, isn't that what life is all about? When your boss tells you what a great job you're doing, but you don't get that raise, you start thinking to yourself, well, did he really mean that? Did he really mean what he said? Or was he just giving me a line? You understand? Truth about the pilgrimage is not objective reality. It's the reality is experienced through this anonymous narrator, the lonely rider, a lone ranger. I mentioned riding along there's always by himself. In relativity, you need a reference point to measure things. So the narrator's solitude makes him moving along with the group, but yet apart from it. So watching the interactions as if from the outside, like I told you about watching people when you're on the train or narrating from outside the train. And even if a fixed reference is not neutral, his human reactions, his assessment, his sympathies, and he reveals himself sometimes. Go back and reread some of these tales with me. If we treat Canterbury Tales like a realistic system, right? The pilgrim stories are like objects in motion, each with its own momentum. The variety of stories, isn't it wonderful? Right? You've got brave people, you've got cowards, you've got bawdy people, all sorts of people. And our understanding is inseparable from the act of observation. We have to listen to the anonymous narrator telling us this. We hear the narrator speak for the first time. He says, "Host, although you may regard yourself as ill repaid." And then I answered, "Not a story do I know, except a rhyme that I learned long ago." "Good," said the host. His manner makes it clear that is some exquisite thing that we shall now hear. So he doesn't know any stories except something he heard a long time ago. And then he begins. But not before Morrison, the translator, puts in a note. Do you remember? Here's the note. Chaucer's tale of Sir Thopas is a parody of the old ballads and romances. I don't know if that's true. You see the question marks I put in there? Jimmy doesn't know if that's true. He believes Mr. Morrison. This is don't get me wrong, this is a great translation. A great translation. Jimmy looked at many translations before he picked this one. And you can go and look for yourself and read. You can read the original medieval English if you have a mind to. You'll probably be there doing that for a couple of years, unless you've got a natural gift. It's hard, which is why I took a translation. He's saying that the literary features that the burlesques ought to be sufficiently obvious. I don't know if they're obvious. The other day, a client told us, well, this should be obvious to you. It's some of the things that people think should be obvious to us are not so obvious, right? And so on and so forth. I'm not going to read this whole footnote here that he put in brackets, but you should understand that he's putting it in there to help us, quote, understand. But you don't need that. Jimmy's always told you to ignore these notes if you want, because of Jimmy's philosophy that you should stay inside the story. These are nice to know things, but they're not I don't need to know this to understand this tale. For example, when we read Hamlet together, and I hope you read it with me, if not, please read it with me, there's many, many, many notes from the editor of the edition that I read to help us understand the English language at the time. This is Elizabethan English, a little better than medieval English, but still a challenge. But you saw for yourself, right, when I read it with you as Jimmy, that with a little time, you can understand Elizabethan English as it's written. Now, why is that important? Well, there's a lot of people who try to rewrite Shakespeare and they dumb it down. Let's dumb it down for the children. Wrong. Don't do it. It's a waste of your time. Stick with the original. And by the way, there's many editions of Shakespeare, so make sure you pick a good one. And it's the same thing here, with one big exception, that the medieval English is not Elizabethan English. Very different. Really, really different. Language is so interesting because, the Anglo-Saxons, which were basically German, right, were conquered by the French in 1066. And some of that is covered in some of my readings. But language is a living, breathing thing. The words themselves change their meaning over time. Why? The way they're used. One of Jimmy's primary rules of grammar is the way you use a word in a sentence determines its part of speech. Words are not born nouns, pronouns, adjectives. They're not born that way. The way you use them in a sentence determines their parts of speech. Well, Jimmy, are you saying I should study grammar? Yes, you should study grammar. Classical grammar. For example, Morrison says Chaucer added to the amusement of his contemporaries by representing his hero as one of the Flemish knights who pretensions to fashionable chivalry. I don't know how he knows that, what Chaucer did or didn't do. I don't believe that. I do not believe that. Well, I believe it, Jimmy. Great. Send me an email, jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com, and say, I believe that. That's okay to believe that. It's okay not to believe that, but it's not important to the story. Because, first of all, there's no way of knowing what Chaucer did or didn't do. He didn't leave notes, a diary, anything. And even if he did, how do you know he's not telling you a lie? Right? So the tale begins. Listen, my lords, and with consent I'll tell you a tale of merriment, as welcome as ever was, of a noble knight on prowess bent, in combat and in tournament, and his name was Sir Thopas. Prowess means skill, right? So Thopas was bent on prowess. He was bent on his skill. He was from Flanders. The child became a doughty knight. As fine wheat bread, his face was white. His lips were red as a rose. Like scarlet dye, his cheeks were bright. I tell you, and with truth I write, he had a shapely nose. What do you think of this description? Now remember, the anonymous narrator is telling us the tale now. This is his tale, not one of the other pilgrims' tale. It's his tale about Sir Thopas, who was a good hunter, wrestler. Wow. And then he goes on for more descriptions. Saffron hair, Cordovian leather. There used to be a commercial about a car that had Cordovian leather. Robe, Ricardo Montalban, I think, was the narrator of that commercial. That's going to date Jimmy. Robe the stuff, the scarlet flame, cosplay. Ladies pine for him. He's no lecher. He's chaste and pure. So he's a good guy. He's not a lech. So he goes riding one day into the wood where there's wild beasts, and he met in nearly a deal of wool and care. He rides into a dale of herbs, ginger, licorice. Remember they used to use that for bad breath in those days? Birds are singing, and when hearing them, fell in love longing. He starts pining. It's springtime, and like a madman rode he, so sweated his steed with galloping. Did you know horses sweat? If you're a horse rider, you do, and sometimes you see that sweat in movies and westerns. That he was wet enough to wring, his good sides were all bloody. What does that mean? He must have been riding that horse hard. So he stops to speak, and bless me now, O Saint Marial, what ails this love to pounce on me and bind me till I hurt? I dreamed all night in a fantasy an elf queen should be my mistress. I sleep beneath my shirt. So he wants an elf queen more than anything else. There's the word elf. Now something is starting to make sense, right? The anonymous narrator told us the host thought he looked like an elf. I'm not saying he's elfish, but there's that word again. So he gallops away again, and after a while ends up in the land of Fairy and meets a giant named Sir Elephant. The giant says, leave or he will slay your steed with mace. And here the host interrupts the anonymous narrator. No more, our host said. For God's dignity, no more. You've rendered me so weary of your downright silliness. I pray the Lord my soul to bless. Your filthy nonsense. Does that sound familiar? I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, my soul. Yeah, right? Something like that. Your filthy nonsense makes my poor ears ache. This is pure doggerel. The devil take, I tell you, such a rhyme. So the host doesn't like this story at all. So the anonymous narrator speaks up, what? Why so? I answered, why break in on me more than any other man and stop me so from offering you the best rhyme it's the one I know? The host says, by God, said he, by God, said he, since plainly in a word, your filthy rhyming isn't worth a turd. You're doing nothing at all but wasting time. Sir, one word of it, you shall no longer rhyme. Alleviate for us. Let us see how that goes. Or let us have at least a thing in prose. Forget the rhyming, just say stuff. In either a merry or... So the narrator agrees to give him prose, and he breaks into a talk about Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. Those are the apostles who wrote the New Testament, right? Consider, that each evangelist who tells us of sufferings of Christ does not say all the things as his fellows do. In other words, if you read the Bible, we should read the Bible on this website. Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John, when they narrate their stories, he's basically saying, do not say all the things. They do not say the same things about what happened with Jesus, do they? Have you studied your Bible? You should. Their meaning, nonetheless, is wholly true, and all of them are in accord in a sense, though in their records we find difference. See the rhyming there? Isn't that beautiful? But then Morrison interrupts with another note, and here's another note. So then he just interrupts and finishes the story, and that's it. That's the end of the tale. He couldn't take it anymore. He didn't translate it. Are you disappointed? Pardon me, I took a sip of coffee. What do you make of this? Well, it's incomplete, Jimmy. Of course it is. Isn't that sometimes with life? You don't finish what you started, right? So it's incomplete, which makes it very difficult to analyze, which I stuck with looking at the narrator per se. But if we understand that it's the anonymous narrator, right, this is the only time he steps up with a tale, maybe we can learn about his personality, like we did the wife of Bath when she spoke. So what does this tale tell us about him? Well, he's self-aware. He's very self-aware of himself, that he pokes fun of himself. If I can't poke fun of myself, well, then you're not self-aware. You should always make fun of yourself, right? Not always, but you should be able to not take yourself so seriously. He deliberately uses a clumsy rhyme in his tale, which is a kind of mundane. Think about it, a knight talking about birds and flowers instead of, defending a woman's honor, like in the Knight's Tale, which was a bloody tale. Like, right? You remember the Knight's Tale? It's overstuffed with clichés. It makes him look like an amateur. And why is that a good thing? Well, because he's really a professional storyteller through the eyes of the other pilgrims. He's playful with the category of a story. He parodies romance, right? An elf queen? What the heck is that? Should be my mistress, sleep beneath my shirt. What does that mean? So no wonder the host stopped him. Stop it, you're killing me. The anonymous narrator is willing to be ridiculous by having his hero skip from dream to sleep within my shirt. And remember, in one tale, a knight rapes a maiden, so he knows how to tell a story, violent story. Second, the anonymous narrator undercuts high style. Courtly romance normally keeps the lady distant and idealized, but this narrator collapses the distance almost instantly and breaks all the rules to the listeners around him. Remember, they're used to hearing stories, and he's just acting like an idiot. Maybe he wants to offend the host. I don't know. And then finally, the anonymous narrator is comfortable mixing lofty and earthy ideas. The line starts with an elevated fairy tale goal, the elf queen should be my mistress, but it ends with an intimate physical image of sleeping beneath my shirt. Maybe he's not afraid to risk embarrassment. He's responsive to his audience, and when the host cuts him off, he doesn't sulk, he just pivots to the tale of Melby, which we don't hear from Morrison. And that's a performer who understands crowd dynamics, but unfortunately we never hear it. So that's really the analysis, because I can't go on. It's a short, silly tale, but it does tell us about the narrator, the anonymous narrator, and I thought that was more important to learn about in this tale. I can't go on. What do you mean you can't go on, Jimmy? You always bring in Aristotle. Well, in this case, Aristotle falls apart. First of all, because Morrison didn't finish the tale, so I don't know how to bring in Aristotle. But I'm going to leave this footnote up here. This is always in my analysis when I bring up Aristotle. There is no plot to say. The character is kind of goofy. The diction and thought are weird. So Aristotle, in this analysis, is useless to me. He falls apart, right? There is no plot. So I still think this is important, not only to remind you who Aristotle is, but to who Sir Thopas and the anonymous narrator were. So Thopas is just his story, right? Sometimes we learn things when they are not up to speed, don't we? You've been reading with Jimmy. This is Jimmy. This was the analysis of Sir Topas's half-baked tale, right? Told by the anonymous narrator who narrated all of the Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer. You can find me on YouTube by scanning that QR code there. That's also the website shortcut. My email is jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. Jimmy@readingwithjimmy.com. And remember this as we leave together. We are all first-person narrators in the story of life. What you tell people about yourself is up to you. What they tell you about themselves is up to them. Their actions will tell you things. Their non-actions will tell you things. So it's very important to be an observer, because being in life, being alive, and an observer, you affect what you observe. You participate in life. This isn't as deep as you think it is. This isn't as deep as you think it is. You may not have thought about observation and how you observe and become part of the story, but you are. And I wish I could meet each and every one of you to tell and hear your stories. I really do. That would be a great benefit to all of us, to hear your story, to be a pilgrim, and we're all pilgrims. This is really a reflection of who we are going through life, not to on their pilgrimage, right? They were on a pilgrimage. We're on a pilgrimage. We're on a pilgrimage to see how good we can become. We're put on here to master things, not just to be stupid. And there's a lot of that going on these days. That's why you should be reading classics with Jimmy. This is an antidote for being stupid. Sorry. Okay, I'll quit preaching. Have a great day. Thanks for coming by.